This month at Manor Park Classics, we are privileged to have this original Renault 5. Now, of course, these cars were phenomenally successful all across continental Europe, but in the UK, these cars are pretty rare. So it's an absolute privilege to have this quite early example here this month. Now, of course, the Renault 5 was launched at the end of 1971, which means it was one of the first real super minis. It came along right at the birth of the super mini market, when all manufacturers were still experimenting with their layouts, figuring out how they were going to design this new era of small cars. And in the greatest of French traditions, the R5 did things quite differently. But doing things different gave this car a brilliant sense of character. It was indefinably chic as well. And so in this little video for you all today, we're first going to talk a little bit about the history of this car, because it is a really important part of why this car is as it is and why this car matters so much now that it's over 50 years of age. We'll then have a little look at this particular example, go through why it is here, why it is as it is, and then of course we will go for a little drive. Now, the French are known for their small cars, and of course they're known for their hot hatches as well, and it would be fair to characterise the R5 as the first car to really encapsulate this. But that's not to say that it was a totally new concept. That's not to say that nobody knew what to expect with this car, because it all goes back to the very end of the Second World War. What was then the Fourth French Republic was recovering from German occupation, and Citroën launched the 2CV in 1948. The 2CV is exactly what France needed at the time. It was rugged, it was simple, it was utilitarian, but it was dependable, it was practical, and it dealt with the condition of French roads at the time, what with its fantastic interlinked suspension and of course the simplicity of not only the bodywork but also the air-cooled two-cylinder engine. Now, the 2CV was fantastic, but it was massively outsold by its main rival, launched some 13 years later, and that of course was the Renault 4. Renault at the time were state-owned, this time by the Fifth French Republic by 1961, and it did very much the same job as the 2CV. It was rugged, utilitarian, dependable, practical, but it achieved that in a very different manner. It had a four-cylinder water-cooled engine and independent suspension, torsion bars all round, and it sold, I think, over 8 million units, if I recall correctly. Do please correct me if I'm wrong there, but it sold in huge numbers, easily dismissing the 2CV's figures. But in the 1960s, the small car market was changing. Or should I say, the cheap car market was changing. Because you could buy cars like the Renault 4 and the 2CV that were very practical, but that were very basic. On the other hand, you could buy a bubble car, which was tiny, but wasn't really all that usable or practical. And the brilliant, perfect in-between solution was the Mini, launched in 1959. Now, that car revolutionised the motor industry. It changed how we view small cars, and it essentially set the template for the mechanical layout of all small cars to come. However, it bears very little resemblance to the Renault 5. What's more important about the Mini in this regard is that it popularised the idea that small cars were cool. Small cars could be utilitarian, small cars could be simple, could be basic, but they didn't have to look and feel like that. Now, the 2CV and the Renault 4 were very overt in how simple they were. And in the Mini's first few years, they didn't sell all that many of them because people were turned off by the styling. People weren't sure what to make of it, and people didn't want to feel like they were downgrading into a car that was so tiny. But over the coming years, pedigree, celebrity owners, etc. would make the Mini into a cultural icon. And it made many car companies realise that they needed to enter this new small car market, one that didn't centre around cheap cars necessarily, but centred around characterful, yet dependable and brilliant to drive small cars. So the year is 1967, 68, there or thereabouts, and Renault start thinking that they need what became known as a super mini. They needed something that could not only compete with the Mini, but also augment the Renault 4, augment the aging Renault 4, not to replace it, but to kind of sit beside it in the range. And what they came up with was the Renault 5. Now, this car was styled by Michel Bouet, and he kind of started this project in his spare time. It was a passion project, something that he just fancied doing, that was then later picked up by Renault, and they sat it upon the essential mechanical layout of the existing Renault 4. So this car was very, very cheap for Renault to productionize, but as I said, it took them into a very different market segment. Now, this little car is amazingly and indefinably chic. It's designed to be as practical as possible in many ways, like the old 2CV and the Renault 4, but it's just designed in a very different tone. It's designed not only to be practical, but also to look and feel like a car that you would enjoy to own, a car that you would be privileged to own. So fundamentally, it is a box. It's designed to have as much interior room as possible, but there are all these little different touches to it that make it feel incredibly modern for December 1971 when it was first shown, and to make it age really well through the rest of the 1970s. As I said, it's quite indefinable as to why this car is so chic, why it's so stylish. I cannot put my finger on it. But there are all these little different touches that make it unique, that make it look different to any of the other small cars that are around in period. First of all, we have this kind of very flat rear wheel arch. We have the vents in the rear pillars and these little very dainty rear lights, which of course enable the huge hatchback opening. That's something the Renault 4 had as well. It was nothing new to Renault, but this new car in the super mini market, this still wasn't very common at the time. But also we have plastic integrated bumpers. This is 1971, when the majority of cars still had chrome bumpers and would for many, many years to come. It just looked so fresh, it looked so different in 1971, but ever so palatable. And inside, this little thing is more of the same. It's so simple in here with so much exposed metal everywhere, more than other cars of this time period. We've just got simple rubber mats at the floor, and we have this little bit of padding on the dashboard, but it's not much, including a very, very simple instrument cluster in front of us. But there is something about the style of it. There is just something about the way this car is designed that just makes it feel, as I said, chic. Don't know what it is. It's indefinable, but it's there. So I want to talk a little bit now about this particular car, about why this one is here. Now you'll notice, of course, it's left-hand drive, and that's because it is a French import. This car was originally supplied in France, should I say, in I think 1974, and according to the odometer, it's done 70,000 kilometers. Now this car came to the UK a number of years ago, and it featured on Flippin' Bangers as well, the television show, and it's also been through a few people that I know before ending up here at Manor Park Classics. And being an original French car, there are some parts supplied with it in the boot, and it's in wonderfully original condition, I must say. There's a patination to it that is by no means scruffy, but it just looks honest, it looks authentic. And of course, the owner's manual is original and in French. So this is over 50 years old, and I wish I could speak French, but I'd love all the documentation with cars like this. It's just, there's something about it. It's character. It's character. This little thing is so adorable. So this is the first time I've ever driven a left-hand drive car, so this is going to be nerve-wracking for me as well. Put down this window a little bit, just get a little bit of air in. It's quite muggy today. But the Renault 5, as I said, was different. It did not have a transverse engine like, of course, the Mini did, and all small cars do today, really. Instead, it's based upon the Renault 4, and that means a longitudinal engine mounted behind the front axle. So it's really mid-engine, this car. And the gearbox is mounted in front of it all, so that's mounted between the front wheels. And that means that the gear change has this silly linkage that has to go all the way to the front. But engine choices were either Renault's old Billancourt engine or the Cléon Font, both of which were very hardy engines and were around for decades and decades and decades. Now, early Renault 5s had a dash-mounted gear change coming out about here, which is just so fabulously different. But this car, even though it's only a 74, has the floor change one instead. And considering it's got that silly linkage, the gearbox is nowhere near where the actual lever goes in. It's got a really direct, very precise gear change. Certainly far better than the likes of the Mini and many other early small super minis. We're thinking Volkswagens, we're thinking Fiats, for example. I suppose the Fiat 127 will really have been this car's biggest competitor in period, in its first few years, as this and that were really the two pioneers of the super mini segment. There were cars that came before it, the Autobianchi A112 for example, but the Renault 5 and the Fiat 127 were really the first mainstream super minis. And the 127 in its launch was actually a saloon. So with its hatchback body, the Renault 5 was really kind of where we start the ball rolling with kind of the modern style of small cars, even if mechanically it's so different. So we have that longitudinal engine layout, which is just weird and brilliant. But of course, this car was based on the Renault 4, and that's how the Renault 4 was laid out. It also means, actually, just incidentally, that you've got this big protruding box underneath the dashboard, and that is the back of the engine. It does, I suppose, mean that the Renault 5 has a little bit of technology on its side, because all but the base model used electric cooling fans, because of course the radiator is a gearbox length away. This car nearly pulled in front of me then. The gearbox is, in between the timing end of the engine and of course the front of the car where the radiator is. So for a very, very simple car, it's got an electric cooling fan, when most other cars, even small front drive cars, even ones with transverse engines at the time, were still using belt driven fans. So this engine is a little bit thrashy and it doesn't have very much power. It's well under a litre in capacity, but it's very hearty. It's got a nice thrum to it, and that gear change means it's a joy to use. I'm rowing through the gears in this car more than I need to, just because it's a total pleasure. But the suspension of this car is arguably more important than its alternative way of achieving front-wheel drive, because all round this car has torsion bars. Again, just like the Renault 4, but unlike the Renault 4, this was Renault's first small car with a monocoque, with monocoque construction, which does make it a bit different, but fundamentally anyway, we have torsion bar suspension all round. Now, torsion bars were always going to be used at the front, but at the back, Renault didn't know what they were going to use until a little bit late in the day. They were originally going to use a far cheaper beam axle at the back, but they decided that they would go and spend the extra money and do torsion bars instead. I'm still getting used to this right-hand gear change thing. It feels odd, it's wrong. But torsion bars offer a fantastic compromise between ride and handling, and they are naturally very, very soft. And that is what gives French cars of this kind of period, Renault should I say, that brilliant lean in the corners. Renault 5s do not corner flatly. They never did, and then they were never meant to be. This car may be roly-poly, but it has fantastic handling ability. It's just so sweet to go and throw it into these corners. Because yes, you get this huge transfer of weight over one side of the car. But it's really tenacious in the way it grips, and the steering, rack and pinion steering of course, is so positive. There's so much feeling in it. It's not overly heavy, but it's by no means light, and that's beautiful from a driving feeling, from a control perspective. It's just such, I think, tenacious. That's the word, tenacious in its performance and chic in its style. When I was a little kid, the Renault 5 was one of my all-time favourite cars. I think because of the halo effect the mid-engine Renault 5 Turbo had upon the range, but I just thought they were so stylish. And I still think that now, you know, nearly 20 odd years on from when I first fell in love with them. But today is the first time I've ever driven an original Renault 5. And it's absolutely beautiful. So if you're interested in this wonderful little thing, then please do follow the link in the description, have a look at the listing, and even come and have a look at this car in person if you really like. If you beat me to it, that is.